Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Crafting with Banish. Now, to make an authentic Stallord, there are a few key ingredients, the first of course being pumpkin puree. You're going to want to grab yourself a fresh block of Sculpey, grey if you can find it. Of course, you've got your greens stuff. And lastly, some ripe armature wire.
Is that joke funny for anyone else but me? I don't know what the intersection between cooking videos, Zelda, and D&D looks like, but it does make it unnecessarily niche, and that's what we do here. That and crafting, so let's get into it.
To start this project off, I cut a thin slice off the top of the can of pumpkin. This will act as the base for our miniature. Then I started making the armature wire skeleton, and since this whole thing is a skeleton, this is a pretty important step. I twisted two pieces of my thickest gauge wire together to create a super wire, and I used this to make the spine and the arms. Once I was happy with their sizes, I adhered them together with some green stuff. Luckily, I had access to a 3D model of Stallord to work from. This was super helpful in getting the proportions right. Once I had the bones of the model finished, I began sculpting the head. Starting with a ball of Sculpey that I cut in half, I tried to rough out the shape. This took many days. For this step, I think having access to the 3D model actually slowed me down. Instead of diving into the clay, I became obsessed with every angle and every proportion being perfect. Eventually, with many iterations of adding clay and cutting away, I had a roughly dragony looking head. I ended up starting over on the lower jaw as well. The Sculpey on its own was just too flimsy to work with, so I gave it its own armature. And now our teenage dragon has some headgear. I continued refining the shapes until I was happy with it, and then I put it in the oven for its first bake. Next, I added the big backwards hat section to the back of the skull. Once again, realized that the Sculpey on its own was too weak, so I added a couple layers of tinfoil to make it a bit sturdier. Then I continued to bulk out the rest of the shape. I gave the skull its spiky butt end, and then I added some fun buns for future horns to stick into. Now with the horns, I finally learned my lesson and started with the armature wire. I prepped the holes that the wire would stick into by drilling and adding some more Sculpey around. I gave this baby dragon a bath in some isopropyl alcohol, then I brushed his teeth, finally tucking him into the oven to sleep. Once the little guy was awake, I began sculpting the horns by adding clay to the armature wire, smushing it until it was nice and horn-shaped, and finally smoothing it out with some more alcohol. Then I slowly worked my way around with a sculpting tool, creating the spiral pattern of the horns. Then you simply rinse and repeat with the second horn. Take those horns and blend it into the skull, and then do it all again. The dragon's got some horns, but it's gonna need some spikes. And teeth are just spikes for your mouth. Keep adding teeth until it stops looking so cute. Didn't work, still cute. And with that, the head is pretty much done.
And in fact, while we're on, how is your head?
Well, I've had some complaints, so I'm gonna move on to the body. This metal greymon needs some fingies, so I added some wire until I got the approval from my supervisor. With that approval, I bent those nasty little digits into a spookier position. Now that he's looking spooky, it's time to make him absolutely awful to look at by adding some ribs. This also took a few attempts just because I couldn't big brain it. I twisted some wire around the armature spine and then bent it until it looked like matching rib bones. Then I adhered the back with some more green stuff. I ended up running out of super glue super early for this project, so I used green stuff as an adhesive in its place. It worked. And once it was all done, it looked like a bad worm tornado with arms.
I thought you said it was gonna look upsetting.
Just wait. I added green stuff to bulk out the ribs and created this nightmare. Then I made a sternum and collarbone using the same technique. I positioned the ribs and put it all together with some green stuff, added some more green stuff to further bulk out the sternum and spine, add some details, and cover up some of my mistakes. Then I took a pair of wire cutters to take out the chunks of the ribs that are missing. Once the ribs were looking sufficiently bony, I bulked out the spine and arms with some more Sculpey, and then I began carving spine details. Oh, so many spine details. I added little spikes to the side of each vertebrae, and did the same thing for the bottom of the spine. And then I moved on to the arms. I added some bulk to the forearm, and then carved out the cavity in the middle to make it look like two separate bones, and then I smoothed the whole thing out with some sculpting tools and some more alcohol. Now, you may be thinking, how are you gonna bake that with green stuff on it? Well, be not afraid, I had a plan. Kind of. I gave our headless bone dragon a cool tinfoil jacket. Is this oven safe? Probably not. But the green stuff didn't melt, so it technically worked. Once it was baked, and because I am me, it was here that I decided I didn't like the pose. So I reposed it, breaking the clay in the process, obviously, but it looked much better with the head now. I just went in with some more green stuff to patch the holes of the shattered bits that I broke, and to add some more details to the skull and spine. Then I bulked out those raw metal fingers. Once it cured, I went in with an X-Acto blade and cut out the segments so it looked more like finger bones. And then I gave this dry bones a manicure. Wait, it's supposed to be scary. I better add some menacing shoulder blades. Starting with a Sculpey ball, I roughed out the shape using the body as reference, and then I added spikes because dragon. And then I textured it to look worn and weathered. And then I added different spikes because dragon. And of course, no skeletal dragon is complete without hair. I attempted to make this hair by flattening out a green stuff sausage and texturing it with an X-Acto blade, but I found it was too sticky. I later learned that it's much easier to do this once the green stuff is fully cured. So once I had a sufficient supply of locks, I added them to our Aerodactyl's skull and spine. Now that he's looking nice and funky, I had to add some battle damage. In the game, he has a bunch of swords and spears sticking out of his skull. So to achieve this, I drilled some holes and stuck some tiny pieces of armature wire in to look like spears. I also, off camera, made some swords and stuck those in the same way. And with that, the sculpt is complete. As you can see, off camera, I added some magnets to the inside of the skull. Then using a glass vial I had lying around, normal thing everyone has lying around, I made a second base, so that I could do this. Yeah. Next it was time to make the bases look like ground. I started with some modeling paste, I pointlessly stippled for texture, and before letting it dry, I added some crushed up cat litter to look like sand and rocks. I think this was a mistake. Using some watered down glue, I added some more cat sand, and I sprayed the whole thing with some isopropyl alcohol. I don't know why. Other crafters do it, so I did it. And when I came back to it the next day, it had cracked. A lot. But I liked it. It kind of looked like cracked dry desert sand, so maybe this is a technique actually. Free weathering. I just wanted to take a second to explain why I chose this project. I love using dragons in D&D, and the idea of a dragon who is so powerful they locked his corpse away in a dungeon is awesome. And in the game, he also has some awesome abilities that translate super well to D&D 5e, like summoning undead, a noxious breath weapon, 2-stage combat. So I made the stats, link in the description if you want to use them for your home game. With our bases finished and Uncle Deadly sitting in the wings, it was time for us to make a hero. I started with a teensy-weensy armature wire skeleton, and then I bulked out the body with some Sculpey. This proved to be a little difficult because the Sculpey doesn't want to stick to the wire. Once he was sufficiently chunked out, I baked it and started flawlessly adding some green stuff details, beginning with the tunic. I gave him a fancy belt. Then I bulked out his head and gave him a nice toupee. And finally finished him off with some out-of-focus face details. But a hero is only as good as his weapon, and this hero needs a sword forged by a god. I.
I am that god!
So, using my godlike strength, I took a pair of pliers and I flattened out a piece of armature wire until it was nice and thin, and then filed it to make it nice and smooth and shiny. I intended for this whole thing to be made out of metal, but I had to go in with green stuff for the hilt details. I'm not gonna lie, making this sword took all day. I made like 4. It was a good day. Oh, and I also made the Hylian shield and sheath off camera out of green stuff. Finally, it was time to paint. I primed all the minis and bases with a black and gray zenithal highlight. I gave Stallord a base coat of brown and built up the colors lighter and lighter with dry brushing. Then I painted his hair a burgundy color with a red dry brush, gave his teeth a yellow tinge, and painted the finer details. And I used a similar technique for the bases, starting with a brown and building up lighter and lighter with more dry brushing. And then it came time to paint our beautiful boy. I started with a slightly grayed down green for his tunic, gave his undershirt a tan color, and a bit of brown for the armor and belts. Then I started on the pants. I started with a tan color but quickly changed my mind because he looked naked. Next, I went in with a different shade of brown for the pouches, added a little ironbreaker metal for the metallic bits, painted the rest of the armor details, and then gave that beautiful blonde boy some highlights. Once all the paint was dry, I put on my flip-flops, went out into the snow, and added some oil washes. I mixed up a brownish black wash, and I started very carefully, only adding to select areas, but by the end, it was so cold I just slopped it over everything and cleaned it up with a paper towel. I gave the bases and link the same treatment because I wanted them to feel like they were in the same space. Once the oil washes were dry, I went in with a dry brush one more time to bring back some of those highlights. And I gave the bases a gray dry brush because I wanted it to look a little more rocky. And with that, it's time for the reveal.
Wrap-up time. I love the way this turned out. He's so awesome. I can't wait to throw this at my players someday. I'm sure this won't be my last Zelda build, but let me know in the comments what you'd like to see me make next, and subscribe if you'd like to come along for the ride. Or whatever. See you next time.